Before we begin, if you agree that respect should never depend on someone's age, clothes, or the assumptions people make in a single glance, make sure to like and subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from, because what you're about to hear, it happens more often than you think. It started with a box no one remembered existed. A plain, dust-coated container sitting on the top shelf of a forgotten archive room at Brightwater Naval Command, sealed so tightly the metal hinges had fused with time itself. A young clerk opened it only because she had been told to clear out the non-essential relics, and she wasn't expecting anything more exciting than outdated badge templates or expired access locks. But when the lid groaned open, the air shifted. Inside were commendations almost no one alive had ever seen. Unit ribbons from defunct divisions, a citation stamped with clearance levels that hadn't been issued since the Cold War, and a letter carrying the unmistakable signature of Admiral Reyes himself. The clerk's hands trembled as she read the date. 8 years ago, addressed to someone she'd never heard of. Someone the base, somehow, had forgotten. Commander Lila Cross. And that's where this story really begins. Not with medals, not with praise, but with a woman in her late 20s walking toward Brightwater's main gate at dawn, unaware that in a matter of minutes, she was going to be mocked, dismissed, and nearly detained by guards who had no idea that their names, careers, and reputations were already entwined with hers forever. The morning had the kind of stillness you only get on bases before sunrise. The quiet hum of generators rolling under the soft buzz of security lights. The smell of salt drifting up from the nearby docks. The crisp edge of air that told you the day hadn't made up its mind yet. And into that stillness walked Lila Cross, backpack slung lightly over one shoulder, hair pulled back in a low knot, dressed in a plain windbreaker and faded boots. Nothing about her looked like rank. Nothing about her looked like power. If anything, she seemed like someone who had wandered onto the base by accident, or maybe someone coming for an admin appointment she wasn't sure she was approved for. She didn't walk with arrogance or urgency. She walked the way people walk when they know exactly where they're going, and exactly who they are, even when no one else recognizes it. The guards at Gate 3 didn't see any of that. They saw youth. Civvies. A woman who looked 22 at most. They saw someone who didn't belong, and unfortunately for them, they assumed that meant she didn't matter. Petty Officer Landon was the first to stop her. He had that brand of confidence only base-level authority can give, the swagger of a man who believes a uniform grants him insight. He held up a hand as she approached. "Ma'am, this is a restricted access point. Visitor Center is on the west side." Lila reached calmly into her pocket and handed him a clearance badge, one that hadn't been used in years but was still active under a classification most of these guards would never reach in their lifetimes. Landon stared at it, squinted, then laughed under his breath, loud enough for the others to hear. "Where'd you get this? A surplus store?" Another guard leaned out of the booth. "Hey, man, maybe she's here for a tour. Show her the gift shop." Their laughter cracked through the cold air, sharp and careless. But Lila didn't flinch. She didn't get defensive. She didn't demand respect. She simply said, "Please verify with command. They're expecting me." Her voice was calm, too calm, and that only fueled their amusement. Landon tapped the badge against the booth scanner anyway, mostly to prove a point, expecting it to blink red. Instead, the screen flashed a soft blue and requested manual authorization codes that none of them recognized. "Yeah, nice try," he muttered, pushing the badge back into her hand. "These old design formats don't work anymore, and you need real credentials to access this base." What the guards didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was that Lila Cross had been off-grid for 18 months on an assignment so classified the Admiralty still refused to release the mission name. That badge in her hand was grandfathered into a clearance channel that superseded half the levels on this installation. And the only reason the system didn't immediately unlock was because Lila herself had ordered its security protocols rewritten years earlier to prevent exactly that. Unauthorized access through outdated ID templates. She didn't explain any of that. She didn't know them a speech. She simply nodded once, tucking the badge back into her jacket. Her eyes scanned the horizon briefly, the way people do when they've spent too long in places where watching the edges of a room meant survival. And then she waited. The senior guard on shift, Chief Mortensen, walked out of the booth with a cup of coffee in his hand. Older, thicker beard, slower steps. The kind of man who'd seen enough to know what not to laugh at. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her. His brow creased, faint recognition flickering like a broken light bulb. He had seen her before, years ago, younger still, sharper, stepping off a private transport with 2 admirals and a sealed case no one was allowed to touch. He remembered it in flashes, not words. But before the memory could settle, Landon spoke again, breaking the moment. "Ma'am, if you don't leave the area, we're going to have to." And then it happened. A crackle rolled through the comm system above the gate. Not static, not routine updates, but the piercing tone of an incoming priority transmission. Every guard stiffened. The line opened, the speaker blared, and an unmistakable voice cut through the early morning air with authority that could snap bone. "Gate free, stand by. Admiral approaching. Clear a path. Open the gates." Every guard froze. Landon's smirk evaporated. The booth tech nearly dropped his headset. And Mortensen, the only one with enough experience to understand what was unfolding, turned slowly, eyes widening, not at the road, not at the incoming convoy that wasn't there, but at Lila. She didn't move, didn't react, didn't smile. She simply waited, her comm now louder than any shout could have been. Mortensen whispered at first, a breath escaping him like a confession. "Cross. Commander Lila Cross." The others stared, confused, disbelieving. But before any of them could speak, the roar of an approaching SUV grew louder, and history came barreling straight toward the gate they had refused to open. And that is where everything changed. The black SUV cut through the base roads like a blade through fog, but before it even reached the gate, the atmosphere around Lila Cross had already shifted, subtle at first, like the tightening of a heartbeat before a sprint, then rapidly, unmistakably, into something electric. The guards who had mocked her stood rigid now, caught mid-breath in the kind of silence that doesn't ask for permission, it demands it. Petty Officer Landon's earlier confidence had drained from his face, leaving behind only the cold wash of realization creeping over his features. The booth tech scrambled to recheck scanners, access logs, anything that could explain what they'd missed. Mortensen didn't move. He just stared at Lila with the dawning horror of a man who suddenly understands he has committed the mistake of his career. Not a procedural error, not a technical oversight, but a failure of the one thing they hammered into every rookie. Respect the unknown, because one day the unknown might outrank your entire world. Lila didn't gloat. She didn't even look at them. She simply stood, hands lightly at her sides, eyes fixed ahead, her stillness becoming its own kind of authority. For a moment, the only sound was the distant purr of the approaching engine. But then, in a cruel twist of timing, the small console inside the booth beeped again. Another message. Another system override. This one louder, sharper, coded to be unmistakable. Gate 3, prepare immediate clearance for designated VIP. Confirm identity upon arrival. Level Omega Directive. The guards stared at the screen. Omega directives were almost theoretical, reserved for the highest level intelligence handlers, special operations commanders, or liaisons carrying nuclear-coded intel. Landon swallowed hard. His mouth opened, closed, opened again, but no sound came out. And still Lila said nothing. She didn't need to. Her silence was speaking for her, louder than any rank insignia ever could. Then the SUV rolled to a stop. It didn't skid. It didn't screech. It simply halted with the smooth, lethal precision of a vehicle used to moving in classified spaces. The door opened, and Admiral Reyes stepped out. Not the polished, camera-ready public version of him, but the field version. Jaw tight, eyes sharp, uniform immaculate, but worn in places only those who lived in briefing rooms at 3 a.m. would recognize. He didn't look at the guards. He didn't look at the gate logs or the malfunctioning scanner. His eyes found Lila immediately, and he moved toward her with the clipped, direct stride of a man whom the world obeys by reflex. Landon straightened into a salute so sharp it nearly tore a tendon, but Reyes didn't even spare him a glance. He stopped in front of Lila, nodded once, respectfully, not out of habit, but out of memory, and spoke in a voice low enough for the guards to hear every syllable. "Commander Cross, welcome home." Lila returned the nod, understated but steeped in unspoken weight. For the first time, the guards truly saw her. Not the civilian jacket, not the youth, not the calm, but the presence. The unmistakable aura of someone who carried secrets heavier than metals. Someone who had walked into rooms most people only whispered about. Reyes turned then, his gaze sweeping the guards like a tidal wave. "Who detained her?" he asked quietly. Not shouted, quietly. And that was worse. Quiet meant controlled fury. Quiet meant consequences. Landon's throat tightened. Even Mortensen's jaw flexed. No one answered. They didn't have to. The Admiral could read the room as easily as Lila could read encrypted code strings. His eyes stopped on Lila again. "Are you all right?" She nodded once. "They were following protocol," she said calmly, her voice betraying nothing. Not irritation, not anger, not embarrassment. Just truth. Reyes exhaled, not convinced but willing to let her define the moment. But the comm tower wasn't done. Another crackle. Another message. This one followed by a warning tone none of the junior guards had ever heard. Unauthorized access attempt detected at Gate 2. Redirecting all available units. Commander Cross, your presence is required in Ops immediately. The moment the message ended, everything about Lila shifted. Not dramatically, not in a cinematic burst, but in a subtle recalibration of her entire posture. Her shoulders squared. Her stance tightened. The atmosphere around her changed from quiet tension to operative mode, the kind of shift that happens when someone has spent years making decisions that decide the fate of thousands. Reyes gestured toward the SUV. "We'll ride together." But Lila shook her head lightly. "No, I'll walk." The guards blinked. Walk? To Ops? Across the base? But Reyes didn't question it. He knew her, knew that if Lila Cross walked, it meant something was already in motion, a calculation, a pattern only she could see. "Very well," he said. "Mortensen, you escort her." Mortensen snapped to attention. "Yes, sir." Lila stepped forward, passing the same guards who had laughed at her minutes before. They moved aside instantly, backs straight, eyes forward, their silence now heavy with shame. But she didn't look at them with anger or superiority. She looked through them with the calm certainty of someone who had learned long ago that dignity doesn't need to demand anything. It simply stands. As she walked through the gate, the entire base seemed to pivot around her presence. Conversations quieted. Doors paused mid-swing. Personnel shifted course. Not because she was loud, or commanding, or visibly important, but because Lila Cross radiated the quiet gravity of someone essential. The kind of figure whose arrival meant the day had just changed. Mortensen followed a half-step behind, his voice low, cautious. "Ma'am, if I may. I thought you were overseas." Lila didn't break stride. "I was. And you didn't think to update your credentials?" She almost smiled. "Almost. I designed this base's original clearance encryption. Updating my badge would compromise the old layers." Mortensen swallowed. Understood. They walked past barracks, the motor pool, the drone test hangars, all humming with unaware activity. But Lila could feel something under the surface, a tremor only she had learned how to read. She looked toward the eastern horizon, brow tightening. "This breach, it isn't random." "How do you know?" Mortensen asked. Lila slowed, her eyes narrowing on a maintenance building whose lights flickered. Just once, almost invisible. "Because I recognize the pattern. And if it's what I think," she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Mortensen felt a chill crawl up his spine anyway. Whatever was happening on this base was bigger than a security glitch. Bigger than a disrespectful morning at the gate. Something old was resurfacing. Something she had hoped she'd left behind. And as they approached the operations center, the monitors inside already flickering with emergency updates, Lila Cross understood that her return to Brightwater wasn't an assignment. It wasn't a transfer. It wasn't even a request. It was a summons. A threat only she could see was rising again. And the base was seconds away from learning exactly why Admiral Reyes had said, with no hesitation, "Open the gates." The operations center erupted the moment Lila stepped inside, screens flashing with red-coded alerts, analysts scrambling between stations, the tension thick enough to cut. But through the chaos, she moved with the same steady, deliberate calm she'd carried at the gate, like someone walking into a storm she had been waiting 18 months to face again. The room didn't react to her youth, or her civilian clothes, or her absence. It reacted to the unmistakable shift in atmosphere that followed her in. The way conversations died mid-sentence as analysts recognized the face they'd only seen on outdated clearance rosters, and locked door briefing files. Admiral Reyes entered behind her, issuing orders that rolled across the room like controlled fire. But even he paused when Lila stopped in front of the main tactical display. The breach wasn't a breach, not truly. It was a probe, thin and precise, designed not to break in but to measure, to test, to map the base's response times and defensive posture. "Someone's feeling for blind spots," Lila murmured, tracing the flicker on the screen with her eyes, not her hand. "They're not in the perimeter, they're already inside the network." A shiver of dread rippled through the analysts. Reyes stepped closer, voice low. "Is it them?" Lila didn't blink. "Yes, we're someone who learned from them." Mortensen, standing stiffly near the door, swallowed hard. He didn't know who they were, but he didn't like the way the word dropped into the room like a weight. And he liked even less the look in Lila's eyes. The mix of recognition and resolve that shouldn't exist in someone not yet 30, the kind of expression carved from long nights, impossible decisions, and missions scrubbed from history. She moved quickly now, crossing to a secondary console, fingers flying across the controls in a rhythm so efficient it bordered on surgical. Windows opened, files unlocked, encrypted logs unfurled. The room watched as she dismantled the breached pathways one by one, closing doors that hadn't been opened in years, tracing ghost signatures buried in the architecture like landmines left behind by a different war. "There," she said under her breath, isolating a strand of code so thin it barely existed. "They're not trying to hack us. They're trying to reach me." Reyes stiffened. "Are you certain?" Lila nodded once, her gaze hardening. "This pattern, it's the same one from the Pelagos incident. Modified, quieter, but the same hand. The same mind." The Admiral's jaw tightened with the weight of memory. The Pelagos incident wasn't something the base spoke about. It wasn't something most of the Navy spoke about. But Lila had lived it, and survived it by unraveling a threat no one could see. Now that same threat was whispering at the base's digital doorstep. Alarms shifted tone again, a deeper, more urgent resonance, as the breach accelerated. Analysts scrambled. Reyes issued rapid-fire commands. But Lila was already moving ahead of the danger. "They're looking for access through the auxiliary maintenance network," she said sharply. Landon's badge scan triggered the fallback system. "They're piggybacking on the outdated clearance pathways." Landon, who had slipped into the room silently, felt his stomach drop through the floor. He'd only meant to prove a point to a stranger, to laugh at a badge he didn't understand. And instead he'd handed a hostile operator a doorway into one of the Navy's most protected installations. I didn't know," he whispered. Lila didn't even turn toward him. "You didn't ask," she replied. Not angry, not cruel, just factual, and somehow that hurt worse. She pulled an auxiliary control screen toward her, overriding the base's automated defense routes with a set of commands written in protocols older than anyone else in the room. Lines of code twisted, reformed, collapsed, and then the main display blinked from red to amber to green. The probe cut. The connection severed. The room exhaled as one, the collective dread dissipating into stunned relief. Reyes stepped forward. "Status." Lila's fingers danced over the final sequence. "Clear," she said softly. "For now." The Admiral's shoulders eased, just slightly. "You saved us." But Lila shook her head. "No, they weren't attacking. They were warning." That sentence froze the room again. Reyes frowned. "Warning us about what?" Lila looked up at him, and for the first time since arriving at the gate, something vulnerable flickered behind her eyes. Not fear, but the recognition of a chessboard larger than the base could see. That they're back, and that the next time, they won't be gentle. Mortensen let out a low breath. Landon looked away, unable to meet her gaze. The ops center fell into a heavy, contemplative silence. The kind that only settles after realizing how close danger has crept without anyone noticing. Reyes finally broke it. "Commander Cross," he paused, not for effect, but because he was choosing his words with the caution of a man who understood their weight. "I want you reinstated immediately. Full access. Full authority." But Lila shook her head, surprising everyone. "I don't need reinstatement," she said. "I was never gone." And in that moment, the room understood why she had returned without ceremony, without announcement, without updated credentials. Because the world she operated in didn't need paperwork to acknowledge her presence. It needed her mind, her instincts, her history. Lila stepped away from the console, pulling her jacket tight around her shoulders. Lock down the auxiliary networks, she instructed. Audit every legacy system for hidden entry points. And tell your guards, she paused, glancing briefly at Landon, whose face burned with remorse, to treat every unknown like it matters. Because one day it will. She started toward the exit, Mortensen instinctively moving to escort her, but she waved him off gently. I know my way. Reyes watched her go with the rare, unguarded expression of a man who knew he owed her more than medals or words could cover. As the doors closed behind her, the room remained still. The crisis was over, but something else lingered, an awareness, a shift, a new understanding that the quiet, calm woman they had dismissed at the gate carried the weight of 1,000 decisions, 1,000 dangers, 1,000 secrets. And she bore them alone. Outside, the morning sun broke over the base, casting long shadows across the pavement as Lila walked back the way she'd come, not triumphant, not bitter, simply resolute. The guards at gate 3 snapped to attention as she approached, not out of fear, but out of earned respect, the kind that doesn't need rank or ceremony. Lila nodded once, a silent acknowledgement, then passed through the open gates without a word. And as the base settled back into its routine, one truth lingered in the air like the afterglow of a storm. They had questioned her clearance because they thought they knew what power looked like. But power isn't loud. It's quiet. It's steady. It's the presence of someone who doesn't need to demand the gates open, because the moment she arrives, they always will.